hopefully, and begin a short presentation. So just really my role at the start here is just to kind of set the scene and just explain how this event fits into the timeline in recent years around this topic. So I was commissioned at the very beginning of 2022 to carry out an audit looking at safeguarding cases where there was a housing related element. That included issues where there'd been kind of hoarding and self-neglect, cases where there had been leaks and disrepair, which for various reasons hadn't been able to be dealt with, where there were sort of vulnerable adults, people with known or not yet recognised care needs. And I reviewed 14 cases and produced a report. I'm just going to do like literally one slide kind of headlines from that in a moment. And that was presented back in July 2022 to the Safeguarding Adults Board. And one of the recommendations of that was that there should be a summit, an opportunity for people from across housing, social care and adult safeguarding to come together within Lewisham and really share practice and reflect on where and how improvements might be made. And we had 48 people last year, a mix, lots of housing providers, people from the council and from partner agencies. And of course, I guess the big news this year has been that, after some, kind of obviously a big process, Lewisham Homes has been brought back into the council, which I think is hopefully going to improve some of the communications and just kind of enable really sort of joined up ownership of this agenda from a housing point of view. And here we are today at the second of Summit. So just a kind of flavour really of what came out of that original audit, and forgive for those of you who were here last year, just really to pull out a few things. I guess when I looked at those cases, it was clear that there was lots of positive practice going on. There were lots of different agencies reporting housing related safeguarding concerns. There were some really good examples of very persistent multi-agency working, especially when people just weren't opening the door and weren't wanting to be assessed. People were really trying to be quite creative about how they work together to engage people. And it was obvious that there was a range of resources within the borough. There's a hoarding toolkit, there was a specialist officer working around hoarding. There was the work of Clouds End, the community interest company. But there was also evidence in those cases of a number of shortfalls in practice. Particularly, there was a lack of clarity around what the criteria for housing related safeguarding concerns might be. When does something really become a safeguarding issue? And although there was some good practice, there were also clearly some missed opportunities to identify tenants at risk from their property conditions. There were instances where social workers perhaps weren't seeming to be sufficiently aware of what a resource and the knowledge that housing officers represent, and that wasn't necessarily being used and incorporated into work as it might be. There was often a lack of reference to the self-neglect and hoarding policy and toolkits. It felt as though people either weren't aware that it was there, or it just wasn't kind of getting mentioned enough as a reference point. And social landlords, obviously frustrated and often operating really difficult situations, were having to, ending up using legal interventions to try and tackle hoarding and self-neglect, which felt as though that could be quite counterproductive for a lot of individuals whose hoarding had perhaps been a kind of a product of past trauma, mental health conditions. And there were examples in which social care had not perhaps sufficiently supported individuals to complain or escalate or follow up in cases where there was serious disrepair, and the need for access to specialist housing advocacy just felt as though there was something that just needed to be happening more consistently. So last year when we met together, an excellent summary report was produced from that event, and I suppose just a sort of flavour of what we discussed, just to bring everybody back up to speed, a sense that early intervention is really important, but at the same time, for a lot of people, especially where there's real complexity there, in some of those cases of self-neglect and possibly hoarding, that actually often a long-term approach is really needed, and that's of course often really challenging in the current environment within services. Despite challenges, we heard lots of examples of really good multi-agency working, especially around serious hoarding and self-neglect. People shared some of those examples. But it was, from some of the polls we did last year, it was clear that the Safeguarding Adults pathway and the self-neglect and hoarding toolkit weren't as well known and consistently used as we'd hoped. Professionals were really clear that they valued or wanted to have a really clear point of contact in each other's agencies. And we had some discussions, and I think we'll continue some of those discussions today, about whether and how existing processes and panels could be used to kind of better coordinate and monitor and escalate cases where the risks get too high. And there was a general sense that there needed to be an expansion of the therapeutic offer, and creation of peer support groups around hoarding. And delighted that that work is carried on this year, and we're going to be hearing soon from people who've been involved in that peer support group. And there was also an appetite and a commitment to repeat this summit annually to try and really build the networks and keep the conversation going. So I've had a good review of the action plans which a number of organisations produced. Lewisham Homes, Phoenix, Pinnacle and Adult Social Care have all created action plans in response to the audit recommendations. And there's been, a lot of action being taken by all those different partners. I guess just some of the headlines: housing providers have been working to improve some of their repairs reporting processes, making sure that they are both completing repairs and also taking a more proactive approach to people who've reported very few repairs, and really sort of coming together to try and think about damp and mould. I know some organisations have set up damp and mould working groups. And there've been a number of changes in different registered providers around how they structure and organise their housing management function. A move in some organisations to a much more patch-based approach, so that people can be engaged and kind of monitored and kind of identified much more readily. And work to both train staff members to think about how things should be escalated, and to make sure that there's really sort of clear internal safeguarding processes and leads. Adult Social Care, meanwhile, has been trying to make sure that they've got copies of the complaints procedures and the safeguarding lead contacts for each of the registered providers operating in the borough. And they've also been working to try and really improve the signposting for support around fuel poverty, which is obviously affecting increasing numbers of people. So just a few kind of points from sort of wider context, really, just to set the scene as well. None of this will come as any kind of surprise to those of you that are working on the front line, but I suppose just to bring it all in one place so that we can think about how all these different factors might be driving safeguarding issues at the interface between adults, social care and housing. Mental health. We know that Lewisham has got above national average levels of mental people living with mental health challenges, and some evidence suggests that that's increasing in incidence. I know Martin Crow's going to share some of the findings and learning from a couple of safeguarding adults reviews that have gone on in the last year or so, and it's really clear that mental health is a factor in most complex cases of adult safeguarding. And we know, of course, that mental health services are under increasing pressure. And then the cost of living crisis has of course got even worse this year. I've already touched on fuel poverty as a real huge issue. Aware in some of the work that some of the housing associations have been doing, that they've been identifying people who don't have had utilities cut off. and what happens to those people, what support's available there. And we know that housing costs for people in the private rented sector have, of course, increased, which has put more households at risk of homelessness and made it much more difficult for people experiencing homelessness to get back into housing. So, levels of homelessness, levels of temporary accommodation going up. And recent state of ageing report that came out of the Centre for Ageing Better has highlighted both the sort of high numbers of people, older people that are living in private sector housing, both owner occupied and privately rented, which is in really poor repair. And which they often don't have the income and resources to be able to fix, and also real findings around the incidence of poverty, particularly in that older age group, the sort of 60 to 64 age group, one of the highest rates of poverty of all adult age groups, with 1 in 4 in that age group living in poverty. And we know that digital exclusion is a real issue, and that came up in 1 or 2 of the cases that I reviewed as my original audit, where older people had perhaps not been able to use online processes for paying rent or raising concerns, and had got themselves into arrears as a result of that. And we know there's been work done on, particularly on learning disability and people with learning disabilities, access to digital inclusion within the borough in the last year or 2. So we know that for those living in poverty, people with disabilities, people in older age groups, that can be a real issue. And then I guess another kind of key driver that we know is increasing is around cuckooing. The London Met has recorded, a more than double the number of cuckooing incidences over the last couple of years. So we know that that's on the rise, and something which, of course, could be a real key driver for safeguarding issues. So that's just a kind of, some sort of background context just to sort of bring us into the space. And I guess just thinking about developments and cases nationally around housing and adult safeguarding, we've seen real increasing profile of housing disrepair, large numbers of cases and campaigns coming forwards, both across social housing and the private rented sector. Just the other week, actually, you had a feature, I know, regarding London Borough of Lewisham's private rented sector enforcement team, who I know have been working really proactively to tackle the relatively high levels of disrepair that you've got in the borough in the private rented sector, and some real kind of work there, particularly around damp and mould. Damp and mould has, of course, been, real kind of increasing spotlight on that across the housing sector in the last year or 2. There was, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, tragic death of a child, Awab's Ishak, in Rochdale, as a result of damp and mould in his family's property, and that has, obviously led to the regulator for social housing collecting evidence from registered providers about how they, are monitoring and responding to issues in damp and mould, and also to some really challenging conversations about assumptions that are made around the lifestyles of people living different people living in social housing, and how assumptions had perhaps been made in our Bishag's case that it was there were lifestyle elements that were contributing to the damp and mould, which I think has prompted some really important and overdue conversations, and sort of challenging of I guess unconscious bias that can so often creep into the way in which organisations respond. And then just last week, there was a coroner's report came out on the tragic death of a woman who fell from her balcony during an epileptic seizure in one of the London borough's housing association properties. And again, you know, although the death was viewed as accidental, there was, you know, the failure of the council and the landlord to provide her with a ground floor flat, despite concerns being raised for several years, was ruled by the coroner as one of the reasons for her death. So, you know, there's really important case law being generated. And a Safe Care at Home review, which has been highlighting some of the challenges associated with detecting, reporting and investigating abuse in care relationships. And I know that's something that Martin Crowe is going to come back to a little bit later. So just to give you, you know, a flavour of what we're trying to achieve here today, before I hand you over in a moment to our first speaker, you know, our second speaker. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, really here to try and keep the conversation about housing and adult safeguarding going, to make sure that there's ongoing space for dialogue, to share updates, to share progress. Today, we're going to be hearing from the newly launched Hoarding support group in a bit. Then we're going to be hearing from Martin Corbett some learning from the thematic review of home fire deaths that he's been involved in. And as I mentioned, Martin Crowe is then going to share some learning from recent safeguarding adult reviews in Lewisham. And we're really keen, as I say, through the chat, through some opportunities for discussion, to hear your experiences and views about what needs to be improved at the interface between housing and safeguarding, and what kind of resources and help and further opportunities you might need from the Safeguarding Adults Board to continue to work well in this area, and also to continue to gather some feedback about the best way in which we can develop local mechanisms for escalating and monitoring high-risk cases. So that's what we're aiming to do, and I'm delighted to hand you over next to Leanne Wenlam and Emily Hall, who are from Age UK and from SLAM, the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust. And Leanne and Emily have been both been involved in the launch of a hoarding support group, and they're going to give us an overview of how that work's been going. And I think, fingers crossed, we might even, though I don't want to jinx us, be party to the premiere, I believe, of a new bit of video material, bringing the voices of some of the people that have been involved in that group into the room. I can see Leanne smiling, so I'm hopeful that we're going to be in a position to do that. So shall I hand over to you, Leanne?
Please do, and it's such a pleasure to be here today and talk to all of you about the Hoarding Support Group. So just to give you a picture as to how I'm going to structure this next 15 minutes that we've got together, I will start by doing a bit of an introduction to Hoarding in Lewisham and also how the group came about, and the funding we've had along the way. I'll then pass over to Emily, who works at CADAT at SLAM, who will explain more about the group and some of the evaluation measures that we've used to track its success. And then we'll get on to this well-expected video. It is only in draft form at the moment, but that should give you a flavour as to what the participants have got out of the group over the 6 to 8 weeks that it's been running. So to begin with, just thinking about hoarding in Lewisham, it affects there's about 300,000 residents in Lewisham, and we reckon it affects about 4,500 people here. So on your typical London street of about 50 houses, you're looking at about 3 of your neighbours having hoarding disorder, which is quite significant. People, as we know, are at higher risk of being evicted if they are hoarders. And it's often tempting to think that what you can do is do house clearances, but actually these can be incredibly stressful and traumatic. There was a study in Camden, and in the weeks following a forced clearance, several of participants had suffered cardiac arrest. So forced clearances can be difficult. What we know works is taking a CBT approach, which is exactly what we have done here with the Hoarding Support Group. So the group built on work that was done in Southwark in 2017, when Caroline Harrison, who unfortunately can't be here today because she's unwell, who is a psychotherapist at SLAM, She set up a group funded by Surrey Council at Dockhead Fire Station. That group was incredibly successful. It used a very similar model to what the Lewisham group does. It's a CBT model, open access group. People can drop in, and that ran for 3 years up until the pandemic. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, hoarding support groups are not one of those things that can easily translate onto Zoom. People get embarrassed about the clutter that is in the background, and it just fell apart and the funding got lost as well. Fast forward to 2022 and realising there's a real need in Lewisham for a hoarding support group. I work for Community Connections Lewisham, which is part of Age UK, Lewisham and Southwark. And the team here are social prescribers. We're getting lots of calls from people who were suffering of hoarding disorder. And we found out that this group in Southwark used to exist, and we were curious as to whether or not we could resurrect it here in Lewisham, knowing that some Lewisham residents were already visiting that group, and there seemed to be appetite. So Caroline Harrison kindly came on board, and we looked to try and find some funding for this group, and we did eventually get funding for this group through an external funder called the Hospital Saturday Fund, and they gave us £2,000 to do a pilot phase of the group. What's unique about this project, I think, is the number of partners involved. So the 999 Club, who some of you will know, who are based in Deptford, who deal with homelessness, they were the lead partner. The Fire Brigade kindly gave their room in kind. We got funding which paid for Slam and Caroline Harrison and Emily Hall to facilitate the group. And Community Connections and Lewisham Council Adult Social Care as well also supported on that project. I'm going to hand over to Emily now, and then I'll come back to you in a few minutes to share the video that we've made.
Hi everyone, it's really nice to see you all today. Yeah, my name's Emily. I'm one of the CBT therapists at the Centre for Anxiety Disorders and Trauma, or CADAT for short, it's a bit of a mouthful, at the Maudsley Hospital. So I've got a very brief presentation just so that you can have a look at some of the things that we've been doing and some of the feedback that we got from sort of some of the standardised measures that we use, but also some of the comments that we got from people who attended. So do I have permission to share my screen? Yes, I think I do. Is that all right if I share my screen with you all? If someone just sort of nods if they can see it. Yeah, great. So in terms of the group, we followed a CBT-based protocol, but it was highly adapted to fit the number of sessions that we had. So we had 7 sessions to use. So we decided on what was the most important bits of each of parts of the treatment. I think that was a really important part of this group because it's much more than just a support group, because it's very much a treatment focused group. So yes, there's an element of peer support because people are coming together and talking about their difficulties, but the focus is very much on working towards reducing hoarding and reducing the difficulties that come alongside that. So in that way, it's quite different to some of the other groups that sort of run across London, because there is this treatment focus and it's using the most evidence-based model that we have at the moment for hoarding. So across the 7 sessions, the first one was mainly a sort of quite a general introduction to sort of what is hoarding, why does this sort of come about and persist, and then we spoke about the CBT cycle and some of the beliefs that come up in hoarding and how we might work with those. So beliefs around sort of the personalization of or personification of items, and other sort of related fears around discarding or acquiring. We then split the next 4 sessions into acquiring and discarding, the 2 main difficulties and parts of the maintenance factors of hoarding. So we looked at the emotional cycle within acquiring, and then also the need versus want imagery exercises. And we also in this part had a presentation from the London Fire Brigade, which really went down really well with the people who attended. We got lots of really great feedback from that, lots of learning, I learnt lots as well, and felt that my home might burn down at any minute after speaking to the fire officers there. But that was a really, really useful session. And then we move forward to discarding what can make this difficult, working on some of the emotional processing parts of that, habituation, and then also sort of the behavioural activation principles that might help people in getting started, which can often be one of the difficulties, as well as then at the end, a sort of rounding up, troubleshooting any barriers, as well as we spent a bit of time that session creating the video. Many thanks to Leanne for that. And then we use 3 measures, so I won't go through all of these in detail, but we've got the Bobby, which is bags in, bags out, which is quite a basic measure around how many bags did a person bring into their home related to hoarding, so it doesn't count for things like the food that you're going to use that week and sort of toilet roll and things like that. And how many things did you take out? And again, that specifically relates to hoarding. The clutter image rating scale, which you might be familiar with, where you have a set of images. So I don't know if you can see that, but it's a set of images around sort of different levels of clutter, and you rate your rooms depending on that. And then the hoarding rating scale, which again is a verified measure, and it looks at the level of difficulties arising from the clutter, so the impact of that, so whether it's stopping people getting out of the house, things like that. Very briefly, I can talk you through the results, and this is after after 4 weeks of the group. As the first session we didn't do the measures, so we did the measures at session 2 and session 6 because we really wanted to get people on board with the group and get them attending, and we know that doing a lot of measures can put people off, so we didn't want to do that at group session 1. But also the second session measures we started at session 6 to make sure that we could get as many as we can, because there might have been some people who couldn't attend every single session, so we'd get another chance at session 7 to complete those if needed. The results are, I guess, mixed across the different scales, but what I would say is that I would interpret these results with quite a heavy dose of caution, because it's such a small time period to be measuring change in. You know, hoarding is not a difficulty that goes away very quickly. It takes much longer, but I think they give you an indication of some of the changes that were made. I think one of the most significant changes seen was on the hoarding rating scale, which is really, really important, because that measures the impact of hoarding on a person's life and their safety, really. And we saw a drop from 4.58 to 3.5 on this. What I would also say is that there is quite a high level of underreporting on these measures because of the level of shame and sort of distress associated with the difficulty, that often if we were working with someone individually, we might do it with that person individually, possibly in their home, so that you've got a way to kind of make sure it's being completed accurately. And then there are the time point 1 and time point 2 scores for that measure. And then for this, so I apologise for the quality of the picture. So one of our group members was really pleased after session 3 about what they'd been able to discard, and they'd taken a photo of it to share with the group, which was wonderful. However, they don't have an internet-enabled phone. We had a few technical difficulties trying to get the picture to us. So this is a picture of a picture, but this is what one person managed to discard after session 3 of the group, and that's including that first introductory session. So I thought it'd be nice to show. And then finally, some feedback from the group. There was some really, really lovely feedback. If I could put it all up here, I would, because people just really, really got a lot from it. There was quite a mixed group of people from different ages and genders, different ways in which their hoarding difficulty had come about. And people gelled really well. There was a lot of support that was given to each other. And there was a lot of learning that took place. And people had really done very well and discarded quite a bit. Not to say that the problem has totally disappeared, but each session we'd start with a check-in, and at the end of each session we would set or each person would set a goal for the following week and what they wanted to do, which often would be based on what we'd covered that session. And then at the next session within the check-in, we'd check in with each person about how they'd got on with that. and that really helped to galvanise the group. It offered lots of shared learning opportunities. It offered lots of opportunities for people to troubleshoot with one another and also share the progress that they'd made, which, yeah, for some had been really, really significant. So that was lovely to see that. And again, we've got a really positive comment about the London Fire Brigade. There was lots of those that I could have put in. As the group was an open group, not every single person attended every single session. And I think one of the difficulties we had is that our attendance kept increasing, but by about session sort of 4, we didn't necessarily encourage more people to come with only 3 sessions to go, as the benefit to that might have been limited. So we did have some new people over those final sessions, but we weren't as actively engaging in trying to recruit more people at that point, because there was some distress about being unclear about when the group would finish, because it had been very helpful for people, and many of the individuals had attended regularly and spoke very highly of it. And that's it. I hope if you've got any questions, please do feel free to let me know. I don't know if anyone's got any questions from that. Evelyn?
Yeah.
This sounds fantastic in terms of having clear evidence of an effective intervention. What are the plans, or are there any plans for follow-up to see how things are in 6 months, 12 months,
so
and whether the improvements are sustained?
So we wouldn't be doing any follow-up with this particular group, but our hope is very much to be able to restart the group. And if we were to restart it, then we absolutely can be doing follow-ups, because we've got a longer period of time to be working with people and to then follow up with their progress. So that's absolutely something we would hope to do, but we wouldn't be able to do it from this pilot, because I wouldn't necessarily expect to see, significant changes from just such a short period of time. There has been changes, and I hope that those are sustained, but 7 weeks is,
So you would be looking at potentially future groups being groups that form, or that people could sort of dip in and out of over a sort of sustained period of time.
Absolutely. I mean, for individual treatment, we'd be offering 20 sessions as a minimum, and even then we wouldn't be expecting people to resolve the whole difficulty in that time. So a group that is more ongoing is often going to be much more helpful, because we've got the opportunity to follow up, we've got the opportunity to reach more people and get more people through and get them the support they need. And as the group grows, it sort of it develops, and people can really learn from other people's experience as well.
I've got loads of questions, but I think I'll contact you separately, because I have lots of questions I want to ask you.
I'm just going to jump in, because I can see Martin's comment in the chat about a funding picture for the longer term, and I can see we've got another hand up as well. But this is one of the reasons why the pilot is only 8 weeks long. We are looking for further funding to keep us going. We recognise it's incredibly disruptive for people to have a group and then to pull it away. So part of our mission is to try and find funding so we can get it restarted as soon as possible, and then we can look at those long-term evaluation measures as well, and picking that up and interviewing people who did attend to see what it's like 6 months down the line. But until we get further funding, we're not in a position to do that. I can see another hand is up. Steve.
Hi, afternoon all. I work for Save the Community Service for Lewisham Council, and I just want to ask, this might be a bit of a silly question, but we get a lot of referrals, not just for hoarding cases, but also for self-neglect as well. In my opinion, I think that they can be quite interchangeable in terms of some of the issues that arise from both cases. But this particular help group, want a better term, would that also be useful for people who are suffering from self-neglect?
I guess I can't comment on individual cases, but if there's hoarding and self-neglect together, that's a really common difficulty that comes up in the group, and that's something that we absolutely do work on. But if someone was experiencing just self-neglect without hoarding, I don't know if they'd find it very helpful. But if the two are comorbid and that's happening together, absolutely, because that's such a common feature. There was many people in the pilot who were experiencing that and had difficulties in managing themselves. The person actually who sent in the picture or who took the picture, one of the things that he managed to do throughout the group was he emptied his bathtub of all the sort of bits and pieces and furniture and stuff that was in there, and was able to then use his shower, which was over the bath, which is a huge step forward. And another member of the group had also managed to clear their hallway because they'd had some physical health difficulties, and at that point nobody could safely get into their home, and also there was difficulties with them getting out if they ever needed to, and they had been able to clear a pathway out of their home, which was really significant achievement for them.
Great.
I'm going to move to next to try and show you the video. I'm hoping technology does not fail me on this occasion, but hopefully it'll give you a glimpse as to what the people taking part in the group got out of it. So just bear with me while I attempt to share my screen. Can you see that? Yeah, great. Let me see if I can play it.
We haven't got any volume, I don't think. Is that true for everyone else, or?
Yeah. Have you shared the computer sound?
Yeah.
Is there a way that I can get sound shared?
When you click on the share button at the top, it should say include computer sound as like a toggle.
Got you. Okay, let's try again.
Is there a way of making it full screen as well, if you don't want to over? Yeah, that sounds good.
The way it's affected me is that I'm embarrassed to have people around. I've had a few friends round and they've had a good chat to me, but they know it's an illness, they understand that it's an illness, and I do try every so often to help myself.
It just builds up and it just affects being able to use the space for what it's intended for, like being able to have friends round. Also for me it's contributed or caused my marriage breakdown as well, and my son that lived with me is no longer living with me because my wife couldn't tolerate the hoarding, so that's just had such a massive effect on my life.
It's made it difficult. Sometimes I trip over, sometimes I get depressed, sometimes I don't go home, but I should do and tidy up. In a secondary way, they affect my life by creating potential dangers like fire risks, which I don't really take into consideration as much as I should. It's given me company and it's given me an opportunity to set goals. When you're on your own, it's difficult to set goals because you've got nobody to bounce back off. When you're here, you've got 20 other people to bounce back off, and those 20 people can feed into you and you can feed back into them. And you get great pleasure when people clap when you succeeded. And we all clap when somebody succeeded. We cheer them on. It's like a football match.
It's good as a springboard because what the problem is with mental health services and that any therapy or counselling you get comes to an end. Well, with something that's a chronic condition that goes on lifelong, you sort of need to get back into a group. It gets the momentum going again on the hoarding. But then when it stops, there can be a tendency for it to drop back.
Wouldn't have got rid of as much stuff as I have, because even though the pandemic's been in between, I've added up all the bags and the black sacks that I've got rid of stuff, which mainly clothes, has been 25 bags. That probably doesn't seem a lot over the years, but in the pandemic, didn't really do any, because there was nobody to come and collect it or you to take it places really. But now it's set up again, I've been doing different things, and yes, hopefully I'll carry on doing what I'm doing. Devastating really if it does stop, because a lot of people, I'm not saying I will, but I might go back to the old ways, which doesn't help anybody.
I need the group to continue so that I've got to stop the work that I've done in therapy for the last few months from building back up again. Because if there's a gap in between my therapy with nothing, it does creep up again and I have to go back on the waiting list again.
It's really essential that this therapy is offered on an ongoing basis and that people are not just have 7 weeks and then it's assumed that everyone's cured and there's nothing else, no other work to do, because the NHS has obviously got a duty of care to all this. And mental health is just a poor relative that just does not get the funding all the time.
Thank you so much. That was a really, really powerful film. Really, really, so sort of brave of people to kind of come onto camera and share their experiences, and yeah, really, really powerful. I don't know obviously if anyone else wants to put anything in the chat, any other comments, but really thank you so much for your presentation. Really sounds like an incredibly positive group, and I hope that there's ongoing funding for it. Thank you. Great. Well, I'm going to move us on to our next speaker, who has had incredible warming up in terms of wide praise for the fire brigade in relation to some of the partnership working that's gone on around the Hoarding support group. So, Martin Corbett, the floor is yours to talk to us about the thematic review of home fire safety. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me? Thumbs up if you can. Hopefully you should be able to. Wonderful.
Yes.
Just like to say, Leanne and Emily, for an absolutely wonderful presentation. Just in terms of my own, so everyone knows who I am, I used to be the borough commander for Lewisham before I then went off to Sutton. So I do recognise a few faces on this group. And I'm so pleased that there is the sort of hoarding support group that you've got in Lewisham. It was something that I advocated when I was there, because I did know about the support group similar that was being undertaken in Southwark, and I will be touching that on my presentation. So I'm really pleased that sort of hoarding group is taking place in Lewisham. Just so that again, a bit of background, I'm going to start sharing my screen as well. So just going.
Oh, Martin, I think you may have frozen there. Can you hear us? Oh, we'll just give him a moment. Hopefully it'll just be a blip. Sometimes when you ask the computer to do too many things at once, it just freezes. Martin, can you hear us?
Whilst Martin's just defreezing himself, I also just wanted to say a huge thank you to Joanna Davis, who's not here today, but she was also helping to run the hoarding group, and her time was donated to us by Southwark, because she's the Southwark hoarding practitioner there, and so that was a really helpful addition as well, because she was able to work with people sort of individually and in the group context. That was really helpful.
Yeah, and was that the therapeutic intervention that individuals are saying they had a 20-week kind of period of, or would that be happening anyway, or that was
separate.
Okay, yeah. That's really helpful. Thank you very much. Martin.
Sorry,
oh, you there?
Yeah. Video isn't. I'm having problems with the video and new Teams. For some reason, it's not allowing me to show my video.
Martin Crowe, do you have a copy of Martin Corbett's presentation? Are you perhaps able to share it from there? Is that?
I can do that. It may be useful, Imogen, I think, for people maybe to close the cameras down.
Okay,
because now we've got over 40 in the room. Maybe that is affecting the bandwidth.
Maybe that. Yeah, I know, Tracy, you did suggest that might be gunging us up a bit. So yeah, thank you very much. If people want to do that, I'll just keep mine on for a moment.
But yeah, I've got Martin Corbett's presentation here. I'll get that on screen as well. So you just want to shout out, Martin, when you need me to flick through.
Fantastic. You there, Martin Corbett? You still? Can you hear us? Oh dear, has Martin dropped out? I was putting all my kind of team's energy into the film working, and no, of course.
So, hello, am I back again?
You're back. Brilliant. I'll turn my
sorry about that.
sensors off. No worries.
So, thank you for that. I see you've got it up on the screen. So, I'm now back. A quick introduction. Previous borough commander for Lewisham, and I'm now retired after 3 years at Sutton. And I have done two safeguarding adults, independent reviewing safeguarding adult reviews in a couple of boroughs in London where 2 people died in fires. I'm now working for the NHS as a fire safety advisor. So I'm still sort of in the sort of safeguarding arena. So a quick next slide, if you wouldn't mind. So before I start, I just want to give a bit of figures associated with 2021, when I was the last year in which I was borough commander at Sutton. In that year, we had 722 fire-related fatalities nationally. 99 fire-related fatalities in the last 3 months of 2021. It's the highest number of figures, a quarterly figure, recorded since 2017, which was the time in which Grenfell died, when they obviously had 71 people die in 1 quarter. 76% of those fire-related fatalities are in dwellings. So it's quite apt in terms of this group. Those people who are dying in fires obviously die in their own home. A little bit more figures that come on around the type of person. So 49% of those people are 65 years or older. 19% of all non-fatal casualties. That's quite significant. In the previous year, there's 46% were fire-related fatalities and 20% non-fatal. So if you divide that up between age, you've got 10.4% are 65 to 79 years old, and 19 odd percent is 80 years and old. So I think if we then look at the cause of fire fatalities, you can look at this chart. So you've got total accidental dwelling fires is about 45% of cooking. Again, 45% of the casualties involved fires that started by cooking appliances. And then if you look at smoking materials, it's almost like disproportionate in terms of smoking, in that you've got about 6 or 7% of total dwelling fires, whereas the casualties and fatalities is far more significant. You've got nearly 25% of those people who die because of their smoking materials. So what's the result? What's the conclusion? The risk of dying in a fire increases for those who are over 65 and who smoke. If you combine that with frailty or immobility, you might not have someone who's elderly, but they have got frailty or immobility issues. Again, that's a significant risk. So if you've got elderly people who live in their home, and it goes back to the point I think that that was made earlier around people who are owner occupied, what I class as asset rich, cash poor, is that they often find that they're living in quite large houses, whether they own them or not, but they can't maintain them because they don't have the money to. And then if you add other issues around drugs, or prescribed or not, or alcohol, that again increases the risk further. So when I was at Sutton, we had 5 fatalities in 1 year. We had an adult safeguarding review in 2018, which you all know Michael Preston-Shute, who was the Safeguarding Adults Board chair, carried out a Safeguarding Adults review and made a number of recommendations. And then obviously we had the pandemic, and 2021 came out of the pandemic. Obviously we had a little bit more of the headache from it, and I was then asked to do a Safeguarding Adults review, and I'll do that in inverted commas. It was asked to do a thematic review into those 5 fire deaths. Initially, it started from 2 earlier in the year, which I recommended they should be Safeguarding Adults review, and we decided, because we then had further fire deaths, that there was a common theme. And as we'd already done a Safeguarding Adults review, and during the pandemic, we didn't know whether the outcome and the learning from that review had actually been implemented. So part of my role was to try and determine whether the learning had been. And again, it's about multi-agency learning. We wanted to know if that learning across the multi-agency had been implemented. So the scope, what fire safety training is complete? Because again, we mentioned earlier around staff training in Imogen's little report. I'll come on to that about what training is available for people out there. Whether carers routinely understood and used to review and triage any levels of risk. One of the things that we looked at is around commissioners. Are there sufficient standards in place, not only for contracts and obviously auditing purposes? Were the multi-agency risk management processes understood in Sutton? And one of the things that obviously you just mentioned around hoarding and self-neglect, and those who wish to continue to smoke despite very high risks. Next slide, please, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. Okay, we set up a task and finish group. So this involved not only those people that were involved in the fire fatalities, but anybody within the borough. So it's all of the housing providers, or social services. It would involve all the departments within the council, lots of voluntary groups, GPs, police, the local hospitals, and anyone responsible for safeguarding within their organisations. We met on a monthly basis to start with. I then also got 5 or 6 other station commanders from the London Fire Brigade to involve and help me carrying out some audits, which I'll come on to in a bit. So the methodology, like most Safeguarding Adults reviews, is around being open and honest. And this is, I think, played a very, very important part in identifying the learning that came from this report. I mean, the task and finish group, I made it very clear, this is not about blame, this is not about identifying fault, it's about trying to identify the learning so that we can improve going forward. We did have a number of cases where there were family members who wanted to get involved, so we took their views into consideration as well. When I mentioned this audit tool, we established that there was an audit tool that had been developed. I think it was in Hull, which we then modified, and it went through all different areas of safeguarding, going through from risk assessments, going through training, going through support for practitioners, going through to outcomes that hopefully, and there was lots and lots of other questions that we would then assess to then identify any learnings or gaps. It's a bit like a training needs analysis or a gap analysis of where the gaps were in people's understanding. And in addition to that, we held 2 practitioner sessions where we got people who visited people's homes and asked them to undertake a questionnaire. This was around on menti.com, which we shared quite openly, and it allowed us to then understand whether practitioners knew how to identify risks and so on and within people's homes. Once the report was then completed, it would then go back to Michael Preston-Shute, considering we were looking at whether learning from his report had been embedded or not, and he was then asked to review my report. So I think it's probably best I go straight through into the learning. As part of that, the term fire safety, and we talk about training, one of the questions that we asked is, did practitioners or did organisations have any specific training to identify risks in the home? And a lot of people came back and said, well, we do our fire safety training and it's part of our standard online, as part of induction and ongoing training. And I said, well, that's to do with work. And I said, well, they apply the learning, the e-learning for fire safety that they do in the work to people's homes. However, the risks associated with people's homes is very different to the work environment, because the work is very much based on statutes. So they have to do that by law. And there's lots of things to protect people when they're at work. However, fire safety, there's no fire safety legislation that applies to people's homes. So when it came to the objectives within their training, it didn't apply and it didn't highlight any risks associated with people's homes or the risks associated with any equipment they use or the conditions that they may have. Similarly, when it comes to commissioners, the commissioning or agencies, part of the contracts would say, do you do fire safety training? And everybody, of course, said they do. But again, that goes back to the point they do that within their work environment. And so, again, the same question raises its head around what training is done associated with people's homes. And so that was then changed to make sure that anybody who provides care services must have training on fire risks within the home. And I'll come on to a little bit of an outcome that came from this whole thematic review. In terms of inconsistency referrals, a lot of the social care team found that there wasn't enough information in terms of referrals that get back to them. Sometimes they had a one-liner, sometimes they had a complete essay. So it's very difficult to try and understand what the issues were. And so what was developed later on was a specific bullet point list of the information that they need. Obviously, the typical things such as the names, date of birth and address, which are essential, but also any specifics around their concerns associated with that safeguarding referral. It may be mental health, it may be hoarding, it may be self-neglect, it may be lack of mobility, it could be because they've got a disability. Another thing that came out was around hospital discharge plans. We had 2 cases where people died where they just recently been discharged from hospital and they returned to a home which they were then confined to bed and there wasn't the fire safety precautions that were in place to ensure that if a fire started they could obviously escape, or there could ways to inform things like care line. There wasn't an assessment prior to them being discharged to ensure that their safety at home was considered. The questionnaire came up, which again identified a number of issues around hoarding. A lot of people didn't know what the clutter image rating scale was, which is quite apt considering the previous presentation, and hopefully people do know what that was. There were some questions around support. We talked about support for individuals that complain. Now, I use this the other way, is that some practitioners felt that they would often raise issues around safeguarding, and yet they weren't given the support that they needed to try and transfer that on to a formal safeguarding review. So that's about managers identifying issues and also supporting their staff. Next slide, please. I don't think I need to go through this, to be honest. This was one of the things that we came out around self-neglect and hoarding. It's an increasing solution, and I think we all know it's more of a long-term solution. So I will wholeheartedly recommend that more funding is provided, because I don't think 7 weeks is enough to be able to continue the progress that people make. I would say it's probably you going into obviously a year for someone to completely rectify their behaviour in terms of hoarding. I mentioned about the understanding of the clutter image rating scale. And we did look into the number of initiatives, one being Southwark and another being Croydon, which they use a buddy system. And I'm pleased to see that you've got the hoarding support group here in Lewisham as well. There was a housing, what role do housing providers play? I think this is obviously the group that we are, this forum, you'd probably be able to identify that yourselves, but this is what we found in terms of housing providers. How do you identify someone who is vulnerable, especially when it comes to hoarding? How do you contact them? How do you monitor them? So you've got loads and loads. So for instance, like Lewisham Homes, we've probably got thousands of people that you try and have to monitor, and you can't keep in contact with all of them. So one of the things we mentioned, I don't know if it's on the next slide or not, but certainly, no, it's not on the next slide. So one of the things we thought about was, how do you contact and identify people? Well, during the pandemic, it was very difficult. And what they identified was that they made 6 monthly contacts, phone contacts to their tenants. And one of those questions that they asked people is if there was a fire in their house, would they be able to get out? And if the answer was no, then that would immediately follow up a referral in person, because it then might be able to identify that they may be vulnerable. And we look about personal emergency evacuation plans, and that's when they start looking at assessment and creating that personal emergency evacuation plan. But at the same time, it's around referring it to the most appropriate department to then provide them with either the social care support, the medical support, and so on. And similarly, you often have repair services. You have people go and certify electrical or gas systems. They should also be starting to look at the condition of the person and identifying fire risks. So next slide, please. Okay. One of the biggest things that came out of the report was around capacity versus risk. And very, again, goes back to this mental health issue, is that one of the things you find is that someone's been given a mental capacity assessment, and they find they do have capacity. They do understand that they have the right to make unwise decisions. And a lot of the time, a couple of the cases, we had people who had that mental capacity assessment, and yet they still died in the fire. So it comes to a point where you need to then have an audit trail to ensure that whatever organisation you're from, you've done as much as you can to identify the risk and mitigate any risk of fire occurring. Now, there comes a point where you can do as much as you can. You can go through the referral system. You can put all of the protection systems in place. You can put personal PPS, which is personal protective systems, in place, and yet they still die in a fire. It comes to a point where that person is unable to protect themselves. And this is where the London Safeguarding Adults Board and nationally are now starting to canvass for what we think should be a fire service protection order, similar to a protection order where you apply to the court protection to say this person is not able to protect themselves, and then it's up to the court protection to then decide on the outcome and whether they are or not. Now, if they are, then obviously we can then have a little bit more power to determine methods to protect them. If they're not, then, and they do die in a fire, then essentially those organisations can say they've done as much as they can to try and address the issue. Next slide, please. Okay. Sorry, you've gone too far. Sorry. So smoking. We all know there's issues around smoking. There's legal frameworks. However, in private homes and care homes, you have risk assessments, and you can actually limit or stop someone from smoking. You can put them in places where they have risk processes in place. So, for instance, out in shelters outside the homes. Obviously, there must be adequate risk assessments. I don't need to mention something that happened in Lewisham a few years ago, so I presume everybody knows about that case. But it does show that sometimes risk assessments need to be reviewed on a regular basis. There are issues also around how you've got sheltered housing and also what they call extra care sheltered housing. So you may have housing which is provided for someone who really should be in a care home, but because of the issues around them being wanted to stay in their own house and hospitals or care homes being difficult to get places for, then those sheltered houses almost become their own, what they call remote patient wards, where they are now needing so much care. It's almost, they're providing you're getting care from services in their own homes that would normally be provided within care homes or even hospitals. And it's sometimes very difficult to stop someone from smoking when it's in their own home. In terms of smoking cessation initiatives, it's a bit similar to hoarding, really. You need to try and affect their behaviour and obviously do it on a long-term basis. But when it comes to other risks, such as use of oxygen, having air mattresses and so on, there may be very difficult conversations with that person to say, you either stop smoking or you don't get the medical attention that you need. So, for instance, you've got oxygen, then one of those things is that they have to stop smoking. They cannot smoke when you've got oxygen therapy. Similarly to having an air mattress, they have to say, well, you cannot smoke when you're using an air mattress. If you continue to smoke, then that equipment will be taken away. Other issues. So we had issues with people who decline home fire safety visits. So we would go and have a referral to the fire brigade, and they would repeatedly visit the houses or the person, and they would constantly decline. And one of the triggers for that would be then, if they decline more 2 or 3 times, it's then referred back to the referring agency, and other methods need to be taken to try and do that home fire safety visit. One of the things which suggested was that the fire brigade give some training to other people who are able to get access, and then they do a risk assessment on the fire brigade's behalf. I know, for instance, when I was at Bromley, we used to have victim support used to go in because they have access to them, and they used to do home fire safety visits on the fire brigade's behalf. I mean, we discussed about social versus privately rented accommodation. Obviously, it's a lot easier if you've got social housing and they're a tenant, because there's contracts and tenancy agreements in place which can be used to try and lever people to try and behave. But when they're living in a privately rented accommodation, it's a little bit more difficult. The landlord's got some responsibilities. Certainly when it comes to changing a tenancy, they must make sure that there's an L2 system of smoke detection within there. We mentioned about personal protective systems. So if people don't know what they are, if you've got someone that's got significant risks and there is a high risk of a fire starting, you can have a personal protective system. It's like a little mist system that you put in a corner of the room. It's connected to a smoke alarm, which if it goes off, it sets off a mist system, which then will suppress any fire. It may not put it out, but it will definitely suppress and obviously reduce potentially and save their lives. We did realise that there was an effect on the pandemic, in that because people couldn't visit people's premises, and a lot of the stuff was done online, it wasn't very easy to try and recognise the risks associated within those homes without actually seeing them. There was a reduction in the number of visits because obviously people were working on skeleton staff. Often people were affected by COVID themselves. So there was the visits did reduce. And I've already mentioned mental health associated with the fire protection order, so I don't mention that. How can housing providers identify vulnerable people? I've mentioned this already, but one of the biggest things is around fire awareness training in the home. And as part in Sutton, I'm pleased to say over the last year or so, I have been helping to develop an e-learning package specifically for practitioners who visit the people's homes, and it's been deliberately intended so that not just people in Sutton, it can be available nationally to anybody should they wish to do it. We're going to trial it in Sutton to start off with before it goes nationwide. Certainly it will be advertised through SABs in London first as well. But essentially that is training specifically for anybody that visits people's homes, with repair service, housing managers, midwives, matrons, district nurses, anybody that visits someone's home. And it also has a tint on safeguarding. So it shows you then what you should do if you highlight some of the issues. And then it looks at case studies associated as part of an evaluations process. It's not like you will pass this at any means questionnaire. So the case studies are used as an evaluation. So I think it's actually, it ticks a lot of the boxes associated with missed opportunities. You talk about earlier, Imogen, you mentioned about missed opportunities. A lot of the fire deaths that I came across highlighted a number of missed opportunities around people going into people's homes and not highlighting the risk. Now, this training hopefully will provide a lot more knowledge and awareness around fire risks in the home. And I say it will be open to anybody. Regular contact triggers and methods. I mentioned about the phone calls to people, having triggers that repair service housing managers would be able to identify, and then obviously refer onward, whether it be an official safeguarding referral. And I think these forums hopefully will highlight that you may be able to do any sort of informal referring to different departments, just to say, I've got this concern, what do you think, can you help? And then the biggest thing here is about working with other partners. You know, these forums, working in the Safeguarding Adults Board is a chance for those executives or people to be able to then talk to each other, to say, I've got this case here, I've got that case there, talking about how we can then identify it. But again, without those people actually on the ground referring it up to their line managers, it will be really important that they do that. One of the things that came out of this again was around, in Sutton, they created a hoarding panel, which was then used to reconcile the hoarding cases that they had, because the fire brigade had a register of hoarding cases, social services had a list of hoarding cases, and all the housing providers had a list of hoarding cases, and yet we had people on those lists that weren't shared amongst each other. They had their own individual lists. So part of the panel was to then identify and reconcile so all the cases were the same, so that when then you get additional referrals coming through, that was then shared with all the other different agencies within that hoarding panel. So no one was missed off the list, as it were. You mentioned tenancy agreements.
Just getting slightly jumpy. Is this your last slide? Just because I'm mindful of time.
We're just starting to. Yeah, it almost is. These are the last slides, and then we can
just checking. Fabulous.
Yeah. Tenancy agreements. We mentioned tenancy agreements. We've started to include, or tenancy were any retrospective tenancy agreements then had a stipulation that they must have a fire safety risk assessment from the fire brigade within 3 months. Clear policies around clear corridors and clear balconies and scooters. One of those things, you've all seen some horrible fires around people dying when you've had scooters charging in corridors. I've mentioned personal emergency evacuation plans. If you find someone that's vulnerable, make sure that they have a personal emergency evacuation plan. Okay, quick summary. Lots and lots of complex issues there. It's got to have a multi-agency approach. And the result of the thematic review was there's lots and lots of learning and lots of outcomes that hopefully, and one of those I think I mentioned about is this e-learning that's come out, so that people will understand the risks associated with fire. And I think it's not just, it's everybody within the organisations. You've got to have strategic support right the way down to people actually on the ground. Can I highlight those things? And you've got to be support, and they've got to be confident that if they have an issue, they can talk to line managers and then push it back up, so that if any issue becomes a significant problem, then they've got the support and backup to be able to highlight those issues. That's it. Any questions?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was great. I'm just going to bring in Glyn just has a quick clarification. Glyn Jones from the chat, just asking if you can clarify the referral criteria for priority 1 addresses in the community.
Okay, so when you say priority 1, in terms of safeguarding, we all know it's a complex issue, and how do you refer? We all know that if you've got a safeguarding referral, that it's often to do with self-neglect or at risk of harm. So sometimes it's very difficult to try and identify what the criteria is. Now, one of those things we use for hoarding as a criteria, and I know we mentioned it earlier, is about the clutter image rating scale. If you've got a clutter image rating scale of at least 5, or if you think it's a 4, then refer it. Because even if it's in just one room, because that one little trigger will then help identify whether that person needs to have a further investigation. We all talk about, the Section 41 referral and investigation, but that may lead on to that. And if you think you've got someone that's got a significant fire risk, if they don't have a smoke alarm in their property, that's an immediate referral to the fire brigade. But it's not a safeguarding adult referral. And that's one of the things we're finding, is that certainly when you get practitioners going out, well, this is not a safeguarding referral. They immediately think it's safeguarding. But what we don't want to happen is for it to become a safeguarding referral. So it's the little things that start off that you then start to have that multi-agency approach, is that you have your contacts to say your fire brigade, you have contacts with social services, you have contacts with the local district nurses that will be able to come and deal with the fire risks, with the health risks, with the social side of things, and perhaps looking after the house. Is that they are low-level risks that there should be a process in which that networking and the contacts within different departments can be used to try and identify those issues before they come safeguarding.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Lots of food for thought there. I'm going to suggest that if anyone's got any other questions, they pop them in the chat for the time being, because I'm mindful that I want to make sure Martin Crow's got time for his presentation. And thanks, Martin, for coming back there in relation to Mary's question about copies of the slides and the resources. I know also Martin Corbett mentioned a whole load of existing or potential resources. And I know Martin Crow and I had a conversation at the start about, the Safeguarding Adults Board creating a web page that specifically parks up some of the resources that we've already got and things that are coming online in one place. So watch this space, and we'll make sure that people can get linked into that e-learning and the audit tool, any other resources that are available. Thank you so much, Martin. That was brilliant. And yes, as I say, we'll come back to any other questions you might have for Martin at the end. But Martin Crow, would you like to take to the floor, please, to share some of the updates and reflections from recent Safeguarding Adults reviews?
Yeah, thank you, Imogen. So I'm going to go through 2 cases that are linked to housing. Then I'm also just going to give a very brief summary of some key issues locally from a safeguarding perspective. And as you mentioned, Imogen, in the introduction, I'm also going to ask delegates in the room today to answer some questions and some polls that we've got. And that will link into the final segment where Imogen, you'll summarise, and then there'll be time there for broader questions and comments, etc. So again, if you've got any questions as I go through my presentation, please put them in the chat and we'll hopefully get back to them towards the end. So I'm just going to put my slides up. Okay, so the first case I'm going to talk to you about is this one. So the Safeguarding Adults Review Arthur, and that was published just last month. And the first thing to mention here is we've used Arthur's real name with his family's permission, but Anthony is a pseudonym. So we've protected the wider family's identity by not using the family surname, and Anthony's name, as I've said, has been protected as well. So Arthur was a husband. He was also a father. He had 5 children. He was a grandfather to 3 kids, and he was also a great granddad. And sadly, he passed away in very tragic circumstances on the 28th of September 2021. So Arthur survived a stroke and he spent 2 years during COVID shielding to keep himself safe, but sadly he lost his life in his own home, witnessed by his wife and his daughter. And the family describe how they lost 2 men in the family that day, Arthur and Anthony. And a quote from the family to summarise that is, "Our family has been through so much turmoil, the strain on our mental health and physical well-being has been indescribable." And you can see on screen there the final comment. This is the first time we've actually conducted a safeguarding adults review in Lewisham that also met the criteria as a DHR, and I'll explain a little bit more about that as I go through the presentation. So in its own right, it is a unique statutory review. So a background to the case, I'll let you read through the comments on screen, but Anthony's mental health was obviously deteriorating, and significantly so, and that in itself was an underpinning safeguarding risk. There was evidence of self-neglect in Anthony's life, which was also obviously a safeguarding risk, and there was evidence that he posed a risk to others because we do know he'd made threats to neighbours. And again, I'll explain in a while, there was also increasing tension with his family as well, which highlighted some risks from a safeguarding perspective. But throughout this period of time, and you can see there the volumes of interactions that there were between Anthony and the housing provider, police, and other statutory agencies, there were no safeguarding concerns raised, although the police did submit a Merlin adult come to notice report to the local authority. It didn't fully make clear what the safeguarding risks were. And as you can see towards the bottom there, Anthony had previously been detained under the Mental Health Act, so Section 117 aftercare was applicable, but that was never actioned, and his social care needs were never assessed. And this again has been a theme we've seen in other reviews historically, although that has now changed, and we do have much tighter procedures around Section 117 aftercare. So again, you can see on screen a long history of engagement between housing provider, other agencies and Anthony. So in terms of the learning points, it is important that for adults who are living with serious mental illness in the community, it is clear to professionals what a crisis looks like for that person, the specific signs or the triggers, and that it's clear what the plan is for escalation and response. Crucially, carers or family members should be involved in this, and they should help inform those plans. And as you can see, this is the second high-profile case that's been published in Lewisham in the last 12 months where that has been a significant issue. So the Joshua Review is again another extremely high-profile case that was published earlier in June 23. So there are connections between that review and this one, although the Joshua Review is not really linked to the housing sector as such. Linked to the first point, if professionals had been talking to the family members, there was evidence, which I mentioned, of tensions growing between Anthony and his wider family and his parents. So again, as with his neighbours, there had been threats made which identified risk, but this had not really been fully analysed or addressed. And as stated on screen, you can see there, older adults, family members are much less likely to be identified as potential victims of domestic abuse. And this is the key reason we decided to conduct a safeguarding adults review in this case rather than a domestic homicide review to highlight this really important issue. So progress is being made as professionals are now talking about adult family violence now more than ever before in Lewisham, and we now do have an IDVA, an Independent Domestic Violence Advisor Service across South East London. However, there is still much more to be done, and we must use this case to improve the profile further. And in the final paragraph there, you can see it really tells us that in Anthony's case, it highlights some issues around health inequality. There are a disproportionate number of Black Caribbean men accessing mental health services in Lewisham and at an acute level. And although there was no specific evidence of racism or discrimination in this case, did services stand back from referring Anthony for a Mental Health Act assessment, where there may have been a potential for him to be sectioned, for fear of being labelled racist or discriminatory? Because we know, again, from a mental health detention perspective, there's an overrepresentation of adults from Black Caribbean backgrounds. And the reviewer in this case does highlight this as an issue. So this in itself would be another form of potential health inequality and potential conscious or unconscious bias. And this highlights that we must use the Equality Act to have challenging and sensitive conversations about the 9 protected characteristics. Although it's a very difficult and challenging issue, because we could make the counter argument that the Mental Health Act is long overdue an overhaul, and it is a delayed piece of legislation that should have really already been passed as a review, as a new piece of legislation. And we do know that there's many stigmas attached to the use of the Mental Health Act, and especially in relation to detention. So it's a difficult area, but nonetheless, the review highlights this. And just a final element, really, at the same time that this incident occurred, we also had the Birmingham and Lewisham African and Caribbean Health Inequalities Review being conducted. So it's really poignant that the review team were conducting this review in the period that Arthur was killed. And as you can see on screen, a statement from that Blashir report states, the evidence highlighted that Black African and Black Caribbean people have less access to effective and relevant support for their mental health. Where support is accessed, the experiences and results for Black individuals are often less effective and, in some circumstances, can cause harm. So we can see some parallels between that independent review and now this incident and this case, this Safeguarding Adults review. So as you saw earlier on screen, there were 60 incidents reported to either the council and or the housing provider in a 9-month period. But were these brought together easily and analysed to provide a broader overview? That's a big question mark. We don't really know, but it seems as if that was difficult, and that didn't happen. The police have clearly identified that they were unable to do this for the 12 instances they became involved with, because their current IT capabilities don't allow them to do that. They can't go back more than a few weeks. So it was practically impossible for the police to connect these different episodes and incidents together without a manual trawl through their IT systems. Although thankfully a new system is being launched next year called Connect that will dramatically improve the police's ability to connect different pieces of information together. So again, this is something for us all to take away from this review. How can we collect and collate intelligence linked to risk? How can we improve our approach? Does our IT systems let us down? If so, how do we manage to override that? Again, that's not it. The issue itself is not complex. It's pretty common sense. But the volume means that it becomes problematic, as was highlighted by colleagues earlier on today. They were talking about 4,500 hoarding cases, 3 houses in every street. So the sheer volume of intelligence and information, that becomes the problem. But nonetheless, effective information sharing has been highlighted now in reviews for the last decade. And a big question for the group is, why is this not sinking in? So again, please in the chat, if you've got any thoughts, comments, ideas, etc., please put them in the chat around how can we improve our approach to information sharing and collation. And then just finally, this is a statement from Arthur's family. There were so many cries for help, not only from people around Anthony, and particularly our mother being ignored, but also from members of the general public, so neighbours of Anthony. A key lesson that must be learned here is if these individuals were listened to, then Arthur would still be with us today. Of that we are certain. So that issue around involvement of the family is really, really important. So we have to work together as partners to tell them we've improved and we are learning from these tragic cases. The second case I want to talk to you about this afternoon is actually an unpublished one. So for the first time ever in Lewisham, we've conducted a safeguarding adults review in 2 parts. So the first part has been done without the direct involvement of the practitioners involved, which has enabled us to produce an initial report so we can extract the learning from that. So once the criminal justice proceedings have been concluded, we'll be able to finish the review and then hopefully have a published report that we can share. So at the moment, this is very much anonymised and we're not openly sharing the initial report we've got, but we're keen to share the learning. So again, that's why it's on the agenda this afternoon. And I just think from a personal point of view, this case really hits home with me because I think the day after it occurred, I spoke to actually 2 very experienced police officers just after adult N had passed away. And obviously these experienced police officers, they do see the worst of things in our society. And even they were pretty traumatized by the condition of N when she was brought into hospital. And that really stayed with me, that this case is really, really disturbing in that sense. And it also reminded me that the first statutory review that I worked on, which actually predates the Care Act, before we had formal statutory reviews and the precursor to them, that was 10 years ago. And the central issue in that case was exactly the same as this one. So in 10 years, we're still highlighting the same issues, and particularly around mental capacity. And that tells us that you don't need to be a trained mental capacity professional to recognise concerns that an adult may not be able to make relevant decisions about their daily and basic care needs. This is part of being professionally curious and just thinking, has this person's mental capacity been assessed recently in relation to whatever issue or decision it might be? And it should be a simple question that all of us have in our toolbox. Just think about, has this person's capacity been assessed recently? And if it had in this case, it probably would have led to very different care outcomes for adult N. So in this case, it started to become obvious that there were signs of serious self-neglect in the property in mid-2021, but it took another nearly 12 months before this was identified as a safeguarding concern. And what we do know is that around 50% of the statutory reviews in England are linked to self-neglect, and most of them result in deaths. So we've actually had hundreds of deaths in England linked to self-neglect, but still very few cases are forwarded as safeguarding inquiries for this subject. So there's a real disconnect between high numbers and high profile cases of deaths linked to self-neglect, as in this case, and also a disconnect with not being referred at a much earlier stage as safeguarding concerns. So again, we ask that question, why is it time and time again we keep overlooking these questions? So that's something for you to think about again. Why are we not reporting self-neglect as safeguarding concerns? Please put your comments, any thoughts or ideas you've got in the chat. So in terms of the next part of this, so N had not been brought to medical appointments, family members were not fully engaging with health professionals, care practitioners were being blocked from entering the property, and housing professionals were also not being allowed to go upstairs in part of the property where N probably was. So when you connect those things together, it paints up a wider and concerning picture that N was actually being hidden from sight, and this was part of the reason she became invisible to services. But were professionals thinking about the worst case scenario? This is obviously hard to do because we tend to see the best in each other and we don't want to think about it, but it is needed as part of professional curiosity, and it is actually part of the think family approach. And a basic question again in any professional's toolbox should be, who lives in this property? Who is here now? Can I see them to make sure they are safe? And if the answer is no, this has to be a massive red flag. And the final statement you can see there, we still don't know if the London Ambulance Service saw N in August 2021 when they attended to her mum, who sadly also passed away. But we do know her physical condition must have been already in a very poor stage at that point before she herself eventually arrived at hospital in October. So again, the key learning points in this case, safeguarding literacy. So serious self-neglect equals risk to the vital interest of the person or the people living in a property, a risk of significant harm. So where we see serious self-neglect, we should automatically think there's a risk of significant harm. It's automatically a safeguarding issue. And although we want to use the empowerment principle and involve the adults to identify the risks for themselves and take steps to reduce those risks, we can override that because of their vital interest and use the protection principle to refer on to statutory agencies. So we've got to be really clear on that. Legal literacy. In this case, we've got mental capacity and self-neglect at the same time. Each of those subjects in their own right is complex. So when you combine them together, it's even more so. So again, legal advice should be sought by health and social care practitioners in these complex cases. But as stated earlier, you don't need to be a mental health or a mental capacity practitioner to highlight and ask basic questions around if the person's mental capacity has recently been assessed. Professional curiosity I've already mentioned, and particularly in this area, we need to think about professional deference. So in other words, just because someone may have safeguarding in their job title, they may have a statutory role, it doesn't mean that we can't respectfully challenge the decisions that they've made. And if we're going to have a good safeguarding system, we should actually encourage and welcome that open and respectful challenge. So again, if you think a decision is incorrect, you should see it as your duty actually to challenge and escalate if necessary. And we do have procedures for how you can escalate risk in the borough. I think family, again, I've mentioned, my view really is we need to almost proceduralize think family, and everybody should just have basic questions that they would ask from a think family perspective. Comes back to who lives in the household, can I see everybody, is everybody safe? And again, questions like how can we support their family, what help do they need, who maybe can advocate on their behalf. Pressure. All agencies are feeling pressure like never before. We have separate crises in the NHS, in social care, in housing. We've got the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis. So safeguarding happens in a context, and arguably we've never had a more high risk set of circumstances than now, which means that the safeguarding becomes an ever more important safety net. And the final one around partnerships. You know, are you on first name terms, so to speak, with key people? Have you spoken to them personally? Do you take time to build relationships in your network? And again, the final point, this case reinforces already well-established themes that we do have other similar cases to this one that we haven't progressed to safeguarding adults reviews because they were not multi-agency. But we've also got another case similar to this one which is being progressed. So these are not one-off cases. There is a trend that it is increasing. We're seeing more of these really serious self-neglect type cases. So again, we must all take away these learning points. We must help to change practice. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see this trend increase even further. So again, the overall summary here. Serious mental illness is a societal issue. It's been made worse because of and since COVID. We have much higher volumes of serious mental illness in Lewisham than the London and especially the England averages. As stated, there is a disconnect between what we are seeing in these high profile cases and what's being reported as safeguarding concerns at a lower level. And again, this self-neglect is a societal issue, and we've heard that throughout this afternoon about some of the issues locally and the volumes of issues we have. I've mentioned this already. We've all got a part to play in making sure that mental capacity is not overlooked. Professional curiosity is something that we can all develop. It should be part of our own everyday toolbox of questions. We ask questions about fire, health and safety. We ask questions about the welfare of pets. So we need to ask about the well-being of people and families. And again, safeguarding literacy, it should be an everyday thing, a checklist of questions almost that housing professionals should go through when they come into contact with residents. That safeguarding is at the forefront of their mind, and they've got that safeguarding literacy in mind all of the time. And again, the partnership work, and I've touched on. So again, thanks to everybody that's attended this afternoon. It's really great to see the numbers, and everything that we've gone through already is great because that allows us to build this partnership approach. So again, please feel free to share your contact details in the chat. We will keep the chat live so you can come back to it if you'd like to. And again, as we've said, we're going to put all of the resources onto a web page. And again, we'll encourage people to stay in touch throughout the year and share ideas, and we can certainly strengthen that section we're going to create on the website specifically for housing related safeguarding issues. So that's the safeguarding analysis review. So quickly, just a summary of key issues that we're seeing just more broadly from a safeguarding point of view. So modern slavery and cocoon are closely connected. Modern slavery offences reported to police continue to increase, and Lewisham has the third highest number in London at present, but virtually nothing's still coming through to the local authority in relation to modern slavery. But we do have a conference actually on the 23rd of January, and my colleague Alicia is just going to put in the chat the link to that event. So please, if you've got an interest in modern slavery, please come along. We're going to have some great speakers there as well talking about that subject, and we will make reference to cocoon in that event. Discriminatory abuse, again, massively underreported. We do see that being reported to police, as you can see, but very rarely reported to the local authority. Again, the same with sexual abuse. Domestic abuse numbers through to the police, again, are huge, and I'm going to show you a slide to summarise that in a second, but again, rarely reported to the local authority, although again, that is improving. And as I mentioned earlier with the Arthur case, more than ever before, we're talking about adult family violence. But as you can see, neglect and acts of omission is by far and away the #1 safeguarding issue in Lewisham. It has been now for the last 7 years, and half of all neglect cases do occur in the adult's own home. And more generally, as you can see, 53% of all abuse is recorded in the adult's own home, and that is increasing. So all of those pressure I mentioned earlier, cost of living, etc., all contribute to it. So again, with your clients, with your service users, we need to bear this in mind. And then the final slide, just to help summarise, again, some of the statistics I've mentioned are in there. And again, we'll put this slide on the resources section. It just helps to illustrate that we need to keep prevention in mind, and there's lots that you can do to help with prevention. So I'm just going to pause there for a second, and I'm just going to ask you to complete a few little polls that we've created just to get your feedback. So the first one is this one. And as Imogen mentioned at the beginning, we are tracking this. So we've got the numbers from a year ago. So it'll be interesting to see what your response to that is. Whether you're using the Lewisham pathway. Hopefully we don't get any in the bottom one. So yeah, please contribute to that. Just give you a few more seconds and I'm going to put another one up.
I'm also just going to post while you're doing that in the chat a couple of general questions that we have for you. So if you're finishing the polls really quickly, you could just be thinking about a couple of general questions, which you could again put in the chat, or we get a few minutes.
Second one, again, we asked the same question last year. So great to get your feedback. Do you make regular use of the formal policy and procedures that we have? And they're actually being revised at the moment. And as was mentioned by Martin Corbett, and he was talking about the approach they've got in Sutton, as many of the boroughs have, we are going to develop a formal high-risk panel for self-neglect and hoarding cases. So when they come through safeguarding, they'll be escalated where needed to that high-risk panel. So we are revising that at the moment. So keep your eyes and ears open in the new year for a new set of policy and procedures on that subject. Okay, the next one. Again, this was mentioned by Imogen at the beginning. So we do know that some housing providers do have these panels. So if you want to include any feedback or comments in the chat, please do so about how you manage that, how it works well, what good practice you can share around that subject, where you do bring people together to discuss high-risk cases. Please give us your feedback. And then a final question. Is this one. We just want some feedback on training. So basic level, foundation level training. Are you refreshing your staff every 2 years, as we recommend? So please give us your feedback on that as well. So they will all stay in the chat. So what I'm going to do is just quickly go back to my presentation just to signpost to a couple of issues. The first one is, again, for those that are not aware of the pathway, this is the web link, and my colleague Alicia will put some links in the chat as well. So it's a series of web pages. So anything and everything that you need to know about safeguarding in Lewisham are all packed into these web pages. So you can see the web address at the top. We do have a policy and procedures template that any agency can use. You'll find that in the resources section, along with lots of other great resources, leaflets, posters, etc. So please use the pathway. Everything that you need is in there. The learning zone, we advertise training throughout the year, which is all free. So there's no excuse really for your staff members. If you can just get them to sign up to the foundation level training sessions we offer, and your training will be taken care of. And we would recommend that because they're going to get the most up-to-date news on safeguarding as well as the training itself. So please refer your colleagues into the learning zone. Yeah, and that's it. So I'm going to pause there and hand back to Imogen for the last 10 minutes so we can just go through any final bits of feedback, questions, etc.
Fantastic. So huge amount of information, and I know a few people have had to drop out to get to other meetings, but I guess the good news is, just looking at those initial bits of poll that you ran there, Martin, we have seen quite an increase in the percentage of people who are using both the toolkit and the Safeguarding Adults pathway. So it suggests that we this movement is starting to bear some fruit. So yeah, I'm just wondering whether people have some kind of broader kind of comments around ideas, reflections, additional information and resources they might want from the Safeguarding Adults Board in this area, or any kind of further questions for speakers, reflections on the material we've heard today. Anyone want to jump in with some thoughts, some questions? Evelyn, thank you very much.
I think for me, the highlight of today has been hearing a really positive account of an intervention that works, that is evidence-based, or at least that seems, or for which there is, at least at the moment, evidence of it. And I thought I would really like to see us build on this and find a way of taking forward that hoarding group somehow through the power of agencies coming together, from housing, from social care, from mental health, because I think that was it. It's just great. It's great to hear something positive amidst all the other stuff.
Yeah,
thought for the day.
I couldn't agree more. And when you think, and when you think about the kind of incredibly small amount of resource with which colleagues have been able to make that pilot happen, compared to the costs of people taking legal action, if enforced house clearances, and all the kind of ramifications of fire risks and risks to the person that we've heard of since then, it does, I agree, Evelyn, feel like a real kind of positive amidst lots of often really distressing, sobering material. So yeah, good reflection. Anyone else got any comments, observations, queries, points they want to raise? I guess these questions around how we really kind of bring together the kind of observations and the kind of evidence and the data that we've all got in each of our organisations is just really feels again like an ongoing theme, doesn't it? I know, Martin, you're planning to do some further kind of questionnaires, aren't you, around how we can best kind of utilise multi-agency structures, whether we need to create new ones or reinvigorate older ones, to kind of really look at how we escalate and monitor and share some of this intelligence. I know we get often limited by the extent of our intelligence and data collection and review that our organisations have, but do you want to say any more about that at this point while we're waiting to see if anyone else wants to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Imogen. So over the last sort of several months, there has been a working group looking at the existing policy and procedures. So it has been agreed that there will be an escalation panel that will be created through the safeguarding pathway. So I think that it's more about the detail now, exactly how that's going to work and the mechanics of it. So it's not about if it's going to happen, it's just the how. And I think also in terms of the review of the policy and procedures, I think we just got to try and find a way to make them more easily read, easily understood. So again, I think that's another issue as well. Can we turn them into, for example, more or less like a presentation that someone can just, it becomes almost like a mini e-learning resource that you can quickly read through, rather than it's a 20+ page document that people might just not find the time to digest. So I think we just got to try and innovate the way in which we share those types of documents, those policies, and improve how we do it. Because again, there's lots of work goes into them, lots of great practice is included within them, but sadly sometimes just not being utilised in the best way possible. So yeah, I think some work there. So yeah, over the next few months that will happen and it will be rolled out. So we will have new procedures in the borough in 2024.
Mm-hmm. That's great, thank you. And just thinking about resources that people are sharing, I'm conscious that Tracy, I don't know if you're still there, you've posted a link there. I couldn't quite open that myself, but I wanted to just say a few words about your risk assessment rating for hoarders. It sounds like a useful resource. Do you want to just say a bit about that?
Yeah, we have found it quite useful just to obviously go back to probably what Martin said, just to have a focus on some of those pointers that point to self-neglect or a fire risk. And we have our hoarding panel meetings, so we obviously concentrate on those that are red or those that have not yet had a risk assessment done, because that's some of the issues sometimes where we haven't actually been able to get engagement at all to determine the risk around those. So we have our hoarding panels bi-monthly. So I'm happy to talk to anyone else as well if you know anyone wants to reach out to me. My details are in the chat as well.
Yeah, brilliant. I noticed you'd shared your email address, and yeah, if other people who are perhaps external to, with external email addresses have any issues opening that up, then obviously get in touch with Tracy, and I'm sure she'll share a copy of that with you. Great. Well, I'm just checking the chat. It seems like we've had some nice feedback. Lots of people saying there's loads of information to take away. Any final comments, thoughts from anybody else? Anything else that anyone wants to check in? Brilliant. Okay. Well, I will thank all of the speakers. We've had some really, really excellent evidence-based opportunities, I think, to really hear both about some, hopeful interventions, and also, about some really, really upsetting cases, but nevertheless ones which hopefully have food for thought. I feel like there's been lots and lots of practical tips, around, differences that each of us can make, despite many of the sort of systemic challenges and the structural challenges within which we're obviously all operating at this time. But I hope that's given some food for thought and progress over the coming months. And thank you all very much for participating. I know it's very close to Christmas, so really appreciate the high levels of attendance and engagement. And I think we shall bring ourselves to a close on time. So thank you very much, everybody. Take care. All the very best.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.